It was the kind of scene that makes you hold your breath. A car parked off a narrow dirt road, the kind of road that leads away from farm fields and into low, rocky hills. Personal things left inside, a backpack, a phone, a half-empty bottle. No sign of a struggle, no footprints leading to a clear path, and no Rico. How does a 6'9" former basketball star simply vanish on a highway trip north? This is still unanswered. Today, Rico Harris. I'm Maya Ellison. Welcome back to Still Unanswered, a show about people who slip beyond our reach and the questions that linger. In this season, we look at disappearances that resist neat answers, where the facts are stubborn and the emotions run deep. Before we begin, a quick note about how we'll tell this story. There will be no music, no dramatic sound design, and no cheap shocks. There will be voices, records, and careful reconstruction of events. We'll separate what investigators have recorded from what we and others have inferred. We'll also center empathy, not just for the mystery, but for the family members who are still waiting for an ending. Today, I speak with Dr. Andre Cole, a sports psychologist and former college coach who has worked with athletes through injuries, addiction, and the collapse of careers. Andre joins me to help think about the pressures someone like Rico faced and why closed doors sometimes lead to choices that baffle friends and family. Andre, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Maya. It's an honor to be here with you and to talk about this carefully.
Let's start at the beginning. Who was Rico Harris? On paper and on the court, he looked like possibility. A tall kid from Los Angeles, he shot up to 6'9" and became a local star. People called him charismatic, magnetic. In high school and at community college, he dominated. Scouts talked about his size, the raw tools, perhaps even an NBA future. But that public image only tells part of the story. Off the court, Rico was a son and brother, someone whose life contained ordinary details, arguments with coaches, nights out with friends, the kind of pressure that can feel enormous when you're young and expected to be great. There are quotes in old profiles that linger, teammates remembering his laugh, coaches saying he had all the physical tools. But there's another record too. Discipline problems, missed practices, and the slow erosion of opportunity. It wasn't that talent vanished. It collided with things that didn't have anything to do with the scoreboard. Alcohol, conflicts, injuries. He wasn't just a headline. He was a family member, and that matters.
Yeah, Maya. Look, athletes like Rico, especially those who grow up into professional expectations early, live with dual identities. On one hand, they're celebrated, the next big thing, the local legend. On the other hand, they carry incredible pressure to perform, to monetize potential, to be stable when everything else in life is falling apart. For a 6'9" player, the world assumes options, but those external expectations don't inoculate you from addiction or mental health struggles. They can, in fact, magnify them.
How so, Andre? Why would that public expectation make private struggles worse?
Because people see the talent and the height and assume there's a safety net. They assume someone of that caliber has coaches, agents, family resources to catch them. But oftentimes the opposite is true. The attention is conditional. It's tied to performance. When you miss a practice or you get into trouble, the same people who cheered you on can step back. And the athlete can feel like the world is only there for the highlights. Then you add injury or substance use or relationship fractures. Those can be existential. Who am I if basketball isn't the path? That question can precipitate deeper crises.
And in Rico's case, we see these fault lines. Reports from his family and local press describe a man who had been in trouble with coaches, who'd had issues with alcohol, and who'd been in and out of programs. Yet he also tried to rebuild. His loved ones describe attempts at sobriety, steps toward normal life. It's this push and pull that makes the later choices, including the trip north in 2014, so fraught. He was, by many accounts, trying to put himself back together.
Exactly. And it's never linear. Recovery and relapse can coexist with real efforts to change. Someone can show up to a family dinner and seem fine, then make a decision in a fog of alcohol or shame that looks inexplicable to an outsider. You have to hold both things in your mind, the man people loved and the failures that haunted him.
So let's trace that lead up. In early 2014, Rico decides to travel from Southern California up to Seattle to be with his girlfriend. He hoped, according to those who knew him, for a fresh start, a chance to reconnect, maybe study himself. He took a car. We should be clear, it was referred to as his girlfriend's car in reports, and drove north on I-5. He stopped on the way to see his mother. People close to him say the visit was emotional. There was talk of trying to sober up, but there were also signs of fragility, texts and conversations that suggested he was not entirely steady. We can map a rough timeline. He left the Los Angeles area. He traveled north. He made that stop with his mother somewhere along the route. And then the next concrete point in the record is a car found abandoned near the Capay Hills off Highway 16 in Yolo County. That stretch is west of I-5, down quieter roads, and the terrain is low, rocky, and deceptive. It's not an interstate pull-off. It's a place where a car could be left and a person could quickly become isolated.
Maya, can I ask, when people imagine disappeared, they sometimes picture dramatic scenes. But in this case, the geography matters. Small roads, hills, the weather. Even a short misstep can get a person badly injured and out of communication. Add alcohol or confusion and the risk multiplies. For someone of Rico's size, large, strong, there's sometimes an assumption he'd be fine walking out of trouble. But that's not how wilderness or rural terrain works. Big doesn't equal invulnerable.
Right. That brings us to the day the car was found. The vehicle was off a dirt road that branches from a quiet county route near the Capay Hills. Inside, a cell phone, a backpack, and bottles that indicated alcohol consumption. There were no immediate signs of a violent struggle. No blood, no overturned furniture, nothing that screams abduction. Law enforcement at the scene noted those absences. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The scene felt unsettled, quiet, the kind of scene that prompts more questions than it answers. Investigators tried to reconstruct the last movements from there. Phone records give some help. Pings and locations that suggest the phone stopped connecting from that area. But stopped connecting could mean a handful of things. The battery died, the phone was dropped in a ravine, the device was left in the car, or the phone was on, but someone turned it off. None of those options pin down what happened to the person. And there wasn't, at least publicly, surveillance footage that placed him at a gas station or store within a definitive window after the car was parked. So the trail grows thin very quickly.
That's where investigations often hit a wall. Technology helps, phone pings, credit card records, but they also have limitations, especially in rural areas where towers are sparse. If you lose line of sight with a phone, that doesn't tell you you were fine or harmed. It just tells you there's a gap. And people who hit that gap, who are transient, who are fleeing something, who are disoriented, are the hardest to track. It becomes a race against time and terrain.
Searches were organized. Ground teams and air searches combed parts of the hills. Volunteers turned out. Family members walked the area. Some people reported possible footprints or signs of passage in the dirt, but nothing definitive. Sightings surfaced along the highway in the days after. A man matching his description seen at a gas station, a person talking to locals in a small town. But credibility varied. Witness reports can be vivid and heartfelt and still be wrong. Memory is not reliable under stress or when people are primed to see the missing person. Investigators rang every conceivable bell, but the core question remained: did Rico get lost or hurt in the hills? Did he walk away? Or was there an interaction with another person that changed everything? Let's pause for a second, Andre. When families hear possible sightings, what does that do psychologically? To have something might have been, and then nothing.
It creates a loop of hope and despair. A sighting sparks optimism. He could be alive. Then an absence of follow-up or verification collapses that hope. It's torturous. Families will hold on to any small detail, which is natural, but it also makes coping longer, wearing. The uncertainty doesn't allow grief to follow the usual arcs. It suspends you.
Suspended. That's exactly the phrase. And that feeling is present in public statements from Rico's mother and others. Love and bewilderment in the same breath. They speak not just about the logistical push to find him, but about wanting to preserve his memory as more than a missing case number. They want people to remember who he was, the humor, the promise, the times he showed up for family. We should be explicit about the ideas investigators considered. The main theories have been accidental death in the hills, voluntary disappearance, foul play, or a mental health or substance-related crisis. Let's walk each one through carefully.
Start with accidental death. It's plausible because the terrain is rough and weather can be a factor. If someone is injured, say they trip and break a limb, even a physically strong person can be unable to get back to the vehicle. Hypothermia or dehydration are real risks when you're far from roads and cell service. If the person dies in a remote patch, it can take time to locate remains, and in some cases, they may never be found.
There's evidence that supports that theory. The location, the absence of a clean trail, and the items in the car that show alcohol consumption. But there are counterpoints too. Searchers covered significant ground, and while the hills are rugged, they aren't an endless wilderness. Also, nobody found personal clothing or other detritus that would suggest a long trek. So accident remains possible, but not fully satisfying as an explanation. Then there's voluntary disappearance. Could Rico have chosen to start over, to leave the car and disappear? On paper, some elements of his life might point to wanting to run. Past setbacks, the shame that can accompany failed careers, and the desire to escape. But there are complications. Rico was well known to people in certain circles. He was large and noticeable, and he had family ties that, according to those who loved him, pulled him in different directions. People rarely choose to vanish without trace, especially from families and communities who love them. It happens, but statistically it's less common in cases where there are close relationships and some apparent efforts to rebuild.
Plus, Maya, the logistics of voluntary disappearance are easier said than done. In the digital age, it's hard to erase yourself. You need money, planning, and often some outside help. Someone who leaves suddenly, under the influence, and without clear planning is more likely to get lost than to successfully disappear.
The third theory, foul play, always hovers in the background. Could someone have harmed him after he stopped the vehicle? The lack of overt signs of a struggle in the car doesn't rule that out. A person could be coerced or lured elsewhere. Yet, crucially, there was little physical evidence to point definitively to a violent encounter. No witnesses reported seeing a confrontation, no DNA evidence was publicly disclosed, and no leads crystallized into an arrest. That doesn't eliminate foul play, but it does make it harder to prove. Finally, the role of mental health and addiction. Those two can intersect in dangerous ways. A relapse, a panic, or a dissociative episode can cause a person to behave unpredictably. Someone might walk into a landscape and no longer test the limits of their safety. They might also make choices to conceal themselves or avoid help. This theory overlaps with accident and voluntary disappearance in ways that make the case complex and resistant to a single narrative.
Exactly. What's critical is to recognize complexity and to avoid forcing a tidy explanation. The temptation is to pick one theory and move on, but life rarely complies. Each theory explains some pieces and leaves others mismatched.
I want to shift now to the human side, because for the people who knew Rico, the theories are less important than the fact that he didn't return. His mother has spoken publicly about the emptiness of not having a body to bury, and the constant flicker between hope and grief. The girlfriend, who Rico intended to reach in Seattle, has described confusion and a wish for accountability, not necessarily punishment, but answers. Siblings and friends remember a young man who could be joyful and deeply vulnerable at once. There's a particular cruelty to unresolved disappearances. You're grieving a life that could still be alive, and that makes rituals like funerals impossible. People hold memorials, they hold bring him home vigils, they keep searching years later because hope is hard to relinquish. That places an emotional labor on families that the rest of us rarely see. They live with an open wound.
And that open wound can become public. Social media invites speculation, sometimes cruel conspiracy. Family members are re-traumatized by strangers posting theories or by people accusing them of negligence. It's an added layer of harm. That's why it's so important for communities to act with compassion and restraint.
By the way, Andre, in your work with athletes and families, what are the support structures that make a real difference in preventing these spiral scenarios? When does someone slip through the cracks?
Support structures that matter are continuous, not conditional. Regular mental health care that doesn't disappear when performance dips. Addiction resources that are non-judgmental. Coaches and organizations that prioritize the person, not just the player. People fall through the cracks when support is episodic, will help while you're playing, and when stigma makes asking for help feel like admitting failure. For many young athletes, seeking help can feel like career suicide. That culture needs to change.
Rico's story sits at the intersection of those institutional failures and very personal choices. He was part of a community that cheered his promise, but the structures to help when things went wrong were insufficient. That's not to assign blame so much as to notice pattern: high expectations, shaky safety nets. Let's come back to the investigations. Over time, the case shifted from an intensive search to more routine follow-up. That's common when leads dry up and resources are diverted. But families and private search volunteers have kept looking in different ways. There have been attempts to keep the case in public view, to ask for tips, to remind people that this is not closed. That persistence can sometimes generate new information. Even tiny details matter. But it also takes an emotional toll on the people who carry it.
I want to add one more thing about memory and identity. For someone like Rico, who had public visibility, his disappearance becomes a public narrative that shapes how he's remembered. That can be painful for family members who want the nuance of his life recognized, the basketball highlights, the jokes, the kindnesses. It's important for journalists and podcasters and listeners to treat that complexity with care.
We try to do that here. This episode is not just about a car on a dirt road. It's about who Rico was, the decisions he made, the forces around him, and how those things culminated in a mystery that refuses to be solved. Every voice I heard while reporting this, family, friends, volunteers, investigators, emphasized the same thing. They want answers, yes, but they also want Rico remembered fully. So why does this remain still unanswered? Partly because of the gaps that are intrinsic to the case. There was no surveillance that captured definitive movement after the car, no eyewitness to a crime, no recovered remains. The terrain complicated searches, phone data left gaps, and the area the car was found in isn't a place with dense habitations where someone would likely bump into numerous witnesses. Small things, a missed witness, a surveillance camera that didn't save footage, a phone tower that didn't register a ping, can make an investigation stall permanently. But there is also a deeper truth. Some mysteries resist closure because of the limits of human systems. Policing resources shift, memories fade, records are lost, and people die. In those gaps, families must live. The absence of a neat answer doesn't mean investigators didn't try. It often means they ran out of verifiable leads.
Right, and as much as systems matter, there's also a moral obligation for community members. If you saw something, a man walking along a stretch of highway, someone on a side road, even a small detail can connect the dots years later. People underestimate the cumulative value of small pieces of information.
On that note, if you are listening and you think you might know something about Rico's disappearance, here's what we ask. Please contact the Yolo County Sheriff's Office or your local law enforcement agency and reference the missing person report for Rico Harris. If you'd rather not contact law enforcement directly, consider reaching out to organizations that assist families with missing persons cases, or check our episode notes for vetted tips lines and resources. And if you are someone who is grieving or struggling, there are confidential support services available. Please reach out. You don't have to carry it alone. A gentle but firm request to listeners. Refrain from online speculation that targets or harasses family members or private individuals. Armchair theories can re-traumatize people who are already living with uncertainty. If you want to help, share verified information with authorities, donate to legitimate searches, or support organizations that work on missing persons cases.
Maya, I would also say, for professionals listening, cases like Rico's remind us to advocate for better continuity of care for athletes leaving competitive life, more resources for rural search operations, and better ways to preserve and analyze digital evidence in the immediate aftermath of disappearances. Policy and practice can change outcomes over time.
Before we close, I want to return, briefly, to the person at the center of this episode. Rico Harris was not only a missing person statistic. He was a son, a brother, a partner, a friend. He had humor and flaws, possibility and pain. That is important to say, because when we reduce someone to the moment they went missing, we flatten their life into a single act. We don't have answers today. The car in the Capay Hills is still a focal point of a mystery. His family still hopes. Investigators still hold pieces that may someday fit together. And for listeners, this is an invitation to hold the uncertainty, to resist sensationalism, and to remember the person whose fate is unknown.
Maya, thank you for the care with which you're telling this. For listeners, know that missing persons cases are complex and deserve compassion. If you have any memory, no matter how small, pass it on. It may be the key someone else needs.
Thank you, Andre. This has been Still Unanswered. Today, Rico Harris. If you'd like to learn more, check our episode notes for responsible resources and ways to share verified tips. Above all, remember that these are people's lives. If you liked this episode, subscribe and tell a friend, not to sensationalize, but to keep the story in circulation, because sometimes answers come from the most unlikely places. Rico Harris was a big man with a complicated life and an uncertain fate. The disappearance remains, still unanswered.